The Battle of Agincourt was fought in the year 1415 during the 100 Years' War between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. The English king Henry V, coronated in 1413, claimed the title King of France through his great-grandfather, Edward III. Opposing Henry's claim was the French king, Charles VI of House of Valois. The 100 Years' War, beginning in 1337, already saw large parts of France come under English control. Under the leadership of Edward III and his son, the Black Prince of Wales, the English had many great victories, defeating the French at Crécy in 1346. By 1380, however, most of this success had been undone, with France reconquering much of the English territory. Following a decade of peace, Henry V would renew the campaign, and the 100 Years' War would continue. Henry planned to regain the English continental holdings. On the 11th of August, 1415, Henry sailed across the English Channel and invaded northern France with an army of 12,000 men. They besieged the French castle of Harfleur. The siege lasted over a month, taking much longer than expected. During the siege, the French began raising an army and assembling around Rouen. However, this army was not ready in time to relieve Harfleur. On the 22nd of September, the French garrison at Harfleur surrendered, and the English took control of the town, and the army stayed there until October 7th. By now, the end of the campaign season was fast approaching. Henry's costly campaign had so far only resulted in the capture of only one town, and his army had suffered many casualties from disease and attrition. Another commander may have retired directly back to England for the winter, but Henry was not satisfied. Instead, Henry marched his army east, through Normandy, toward the English-held stronghold of Calais. After moving south and crossing the River Somme, the English army moved north, but they were outmaneuvered by the French army, who had now caught up to them and was now blocking their path. The French army camped between the villages of Agincourt and Tramcourt, and now prevented the English from advancing any further. Henry's army now consisted of less than 9,000 men. The army was tired and hungry. After marching for 2 weeks, they had very little food, and they were not in a position to wait. The French army, led by Dauphin Charles d'Albert, numbered over 15,000. They significantly outnumbered the English, and they had plenty of supplies. Roughly 80% of the English army was made up of archers, while the remaining 20% consisted of knights, infantry, and men-at-arms. The French army consisted of around 8,000 infantry, 5,000 archers and crossbows, and 2,000 cavalry. The English had no cavalry. Despite their advantage, the French did not immediately attack. Instead, they were content to wait for reinforcements. A large portion of the French nobility accompanied the army, and it was even suggested that the English would not fight and flee when they saw how many French princes they would be fighting. As the French army grew larger, the situation grew desperate. Henry could not afford to wait or fight defensively. He had to somehow force an engagement. As the sun rose on the morning of October 25th, Henry deployed his army across a 750-yard field, flanked by tree lines on both sides. The archers, consisting of English and Welsh longbowmen, were positioned on the left and right flanks, with the infantry and men-at-arms located in the center. Some makeshift defenses were constructed, and Henry ordered the archers to place sharpened stakes in the ground in front of them, in order to defend the archers against cavalry. Some archers were also deployed in the center, and others were concealed in the trees on the sides of the field. The infantry in the center was further divided into 3 groups, with the right wing led by Edward, Duke of York, the left wing led by Baron Thomas Camoys, and the center led by King Henry himself. The French army was organized into 3 lines. The first line, the vanguard, consisted of heavily armored and well-equipped dismounted knights and men-at-arms. The second line, the main battle, also partially consisted of dismounted knights and men-at-arms. Both of these lines were arrayed in tight, dense formation, about 16 ranks each. Seeing the state of the English army, the French were eager and confident of victory, so many French lords and nobles demanded and got places in the front lines, where they would have greater chance to acquire glory and ransoms. This resulted in the bulk of the knights and heavy infantry being placed in the front, with the crossbows and other lower quality troops being placed behind. Dauphin Charles the albret and almost all of the leading nobles were assigned to the vanguard, while John I, Duke of Alençon, and Edward III, Duke of Bar, led the main battle. The third line, the French rearguard, consisted mostly of mounted troops, servants, and light cavalry. To disperse the enemy archers, there was also a separate elite cavalry force of around 1,200 mounted French knights, distributed evenly between both flanks of the vanguard. King Henry knew his army would fight better defensively, but he could not afford to wait any longer. The English made the first move, hoping to bait the French into committing to an attack. Henry ordered his army to leave their defensive position and march towards the French camp. Once their longbows were in range, the archers redeployed their defensive stakes and began shooting arrow volleys at the French from their new position. Henry's gamble worked, and the unprepared French men-at-arms began eagerly advancing across the muddy field to engage the English. As the infantry in the vanguard advanced towards the English center, the French cavalry formed up on the flanks and attacked, charging directly at the English archers. The charge of the French cavalry utterly failed. As the knights advanced on the English positions, they ran into a terrifying cloud of arrows. Many knights were cut down, shot from their horses, or had their mounts killed underneath them. While most of the French knights were not killed before reaching the English lines, once they did reach the archers, the attack had lost its momentum. The English defenses prevented them from reaching the archers, and some horses were even impaled on the sharp stakes. The failure of the French cavalry charge plunged the rest of the army into chaos. The arrows caused many knights to lose control of their horses, and the survivors began a panicked retreat. As the retreating cavalry fled back towards the camp, they collided with the advancing infantry in the vanguard, disrupting their formation and causing even more pandemonium. Some knights who lost their mounts before reaching the front line continued on foot, joining with the vanguard and the main battle lines. Now the English longbowmen turned their attention to the advancing formation of French infantry. In order to reach the English lines, the dismounted French knights and infantry had to cross a roughly 1,000-yard distance on foot, while subject to what eyewitnesses described as a terrifying hail of arrow shot. As they marched closer to the English men-at-arms, they increasingly had to march around or over their fallen comrades. Adding to this was the unfavorable weather and terrain. Heavy rainfall from the previous night had turned the freshly plowed field into a sea of mud. And the charge of the French heavy cavalry churned up the muddy field even more. The French monk of St. Denis described the French troops as marching through the mud, where they sank up to their knees, so they were already overcome with fatigue. By the time the French knights reached the English lines, some could scarcely lift their weapons. Due to the failure of the cavalry to destroy the English archers, withering arrow volleys persisted. When the attack of the French infantry came, it focused overwhelmingly on the English center. If the French infantry had instead attacked the archers directly, it is possible they may have quickly been able to overwhelm them. It is also possible that, like the cavalry, some French infantry tried and were unable to reach the English archers on the flanks. But due to the English fortifications, and because the muddy field was hemmed by dense woodland on both sides, this resulted in a funneling effect of the French attack towards the English center, trying to get past the English archers by attacking through the center, where the fortifications were weakest, and the English knights and men-at-arms were waiting for them. It is more likely, however, that the French knights purposefully chose to ignore the archers and instead rushed the English king in an attempt to end the battle quickly. The French outnumbered the English so immensely that they considered the battle all but won. Many of the noble French knights saw the archers as beneath them, of the peasant class, and not worthy of combat. They may have simply underestimated the archers, or they surely would have been eager to capture an English knight or lord, who could then be exchanged for a large ransom. Whatever the case, when the attack of the French men-at-arms came, it came with extreme intensity. Once the surviving French knights reached the English lines, a savage melee ensued, and the archers continued to fire on the attackers point blank. The attack had great momentum, and the English center was pushed back. As the melee developed, the second French line also joined the attack, but because of the limited space, their numbers could not be used effectively. The French monk of Saint Denis described how the vanguard found itself so tightly packed that those knights towards the front did not have space to even use their swords. Some sources suggest that the French at the back of the formation were literally adding their weight to the advance, without realizing that they were actually hindering the ability of those knights at the front to fight by pushing them into the English formation of lance points. After the initial wave, the French were fighting over the bodies of those who had fallen before them, and the press of the attack was so tight that some men may have suffocated in their armor. In the soft mud, some of the heavily armored knights who were knocked to the ground were unable to get back up, with some sources even claiming that some knights drowned in their helmets. It was absolute hell on earth. Contemporary English accounts claim that King Henry himself fought hand-to-hand during the battle. Upon hearing that his youngest brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, had been wounded, Henry took his household guard and stood over his brother in the front rank of the fighting, until his brother could be dragged to safety. The king was also wounded during the fighting, receiving an axe blow to the head, which knocked off a piece of the crown which formed part of his helmet. And the Duke of York was killed during the battle. The fighting was savage. Although the English were being slowly pushed back, the line eventually stabilized, and the English held firm. When the archers ran out of arrows, they dropped their bows and, using hatchets, swords, and mallets, they attacked the wounded and fatigued French men-at-arms massed in front of them, rushing them from the sides. The fighting lasted over 3 hours. The exhausted French knights were slowly overwhelmed by the thousands of light-armored longbowmen, combined with the resilient English knights. Eventually, the Frenchmen in the first and second lines were either killed in the thousands or taken prisoner. Those Frenchmen who were able to escape retreated and joined the third line back towards the French camp. During the battle, a force of French cavalry attacked and looted the English baggage train. This did not change the outcome of the battle, however. At some point after the fighting had ceased, Henry became alarmed that the French were regrouping, and the third line, the rearguard, was preparing for another attack. In an unusual turn of events, the English took so many prisoners from the first and second lines that the French prisoners actually outnumbered their English captors. If the French decided to attack again, at this point it would have been a total disaster. Therefore, Henry ordered the French prisoners, numbering several thousand, to be executed. Only the highest-ranking nobles, those who could fetch large ransoms, were ordered to be spared. Although Henry threatened to hang those who did not obey his orders, the English knights did not participate in the slaughter, as they saw this behavior as contrary to their code of chivalry. The English archers went about massacring the wounded and exhausted prisoners. Meanwhile, the French third line saw this happening and quietly withdrew from the battlefield. The battle was over. Henry V had won the day. After the battle, Henry V returned to England a conquering hero. The result of the battle was complex, as it did not immediately lead to French territorial losses. But 18 months later, Henry would renew the campaign in France, taking over large swaths of territory. These conquests were made easier by the Battle of Agincourt, which significantly weakened the French military. The English victory effectively extended the 100 Years' War, which continued for another 4 decades. The French had suffered a catastrophic defeat. Overall, 6,000 men lay dead on the battlefield. The list of casualties, one historian commented, read like a roll call of all of the military and political leaders of the past generation. 3,000 knights and squires were killed. Over 100 great lords and 2,600 other corpses were also found on the battlefield, who did not have coats of arms to identify them. Dauphin Charles d'Albert, the Constable of France, was among the fallen. In the words of Juliet Barker, the battle cut a great swath through the natural leaders of French society. For the English, casualties were much smaller by comparison. Estimates vary, with some estimates being as low as 100 and others as high as 600. The Battle of Agincourt was a turning point in history that changed military tactics forever. The importance of the English archers in this battle really cannot be overstated. Alongside Henry V's steadfast leadership, the archers were undoubtedly the most important winning factor for the English. Many describe the battle as the death of chivalry, as so many French knights were brutally slain by low-born archers, of which many were recruited from the peasant class. This was in many ways unprecedented for the time. The failure of the French cavalry charge was a sign of things to come. No longer could the heavy cavalry charge be every medieval army's trump tactic. As the medieval era came to an end over the following decades, cavalry became gradually less and less of an important factor in later Renaissance and early modern armies. Cavalry would eventually take a back seat to infantry and missile troops. And with the introduction of gunpowder, projectile warfare inevitably became the new normal way in which future wars would be fought.